traveling a little bit this week. I've been in Atlanta. I had told, I know some of you probably, that our company got bought out back in August of last year. And so this week was the first time that we all got together for a manager's meeting. It was an experience. The CEO of the company got up, and in the first 2 minutes on stage, he had fired off a line of curse words and made a gynecologist joke. So I turned to some people that were with me, and I go, man, this is a different world than what we're used to. I was used to working for a company that was much more professional. And after he came off stage and the COO comes up and he's cussing, and then the chief financial officer comes up and he's cussing, and you know, it's going to take some getting used to. And thank goodness I'm not around that all the time. That's just a once-a-year thing, and I can put up with anything for a couple of days. And then, of course, we have dinners at night, and we have lots of cocktail hours, if you will, and I'm just glad to be home. We'll just say that. But it kind of actually did play into kind of what my lesson is about tonight. But lots of excitement. We had dinner last night. It's the last night of the meeting, and we all had this big dinner, and they had a comedian, and we're getting ready to leave, and we're staying right downtown Atlanta, right in the middle of it, Peachtree Center. And so after dinner, and the comedian's off the stage, and the chief operating officer comes up and, you know, kind of tells us how much good time it's been and appreciates everybody for coming. And we kind of get up to head to the door, and he says, wait a minute, we can't go anywhere. There's been a shooting. The Atlanta police have downtown on lockdown, and you can't go outside. So yet another reason I'm glad to come home. We had to wait out for about 30, 40 minutes, and then finally we got out, and it was strange because downtown Atlanta was a ghost town. They had that thing shut down for blocks around, and there were police, but there were no cars, and it was very just weird. So anyway, pray for me. I'm not nearly as prepared as I would like to be with the traveling and then just getting home today and just kind of jotting notes, and I kind of had an idea of what I wanted to talk about, but anyway. But it was interesting that while I'm sitting there, and when you're in a room with 900 people, and you're probably one of maybe 15 or 20 that don't drink, and everybody else is throwing them down, you know, you feel like the odd man out. It's kind of peer pressure. And that's kind of what I wanted to talk about tonight. I was preparing for my Sunday school class Sunday, and was reading something else, and this kind of popped up, and it just kind of made sense. There's a lot of things going on in our community right now. There's a lot of things going on in our country right now. And I know, as I was talking about my ordeals last night, or the guys were keeping me kind of up to date with what was going on Monday night at the meeting. And that's a different kind of peer pressure, but it's the same kind of pressure. We were wanting, a large group of people was wanting to influence people's votes, hopefully in a good way in this instance, but kind of what I wanted to talk about is not necessarily such a good way. So we'll start peer pressure. So everybody knows what peer pressure is. It's being pressured into doing something or trying to do something that someone's wanting you to do for them or do with them. So we see it in our country, as I said. We see it in our county. We see it in our community. But we're going to read a few verses tonight. It's not a very long message at all. I only have 5 verses that I want to talk about just for a few minutes. But the Bible tells us that we should never allow ourselves to be pressured to go along with anything that we don't believe in. And so the first the verses that I want to read tonight are Exodus chapter 23, verses 2 and 3. And if you look in verse 2, it says, thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil, neither shalt thou speak in a cause to decline after many to wrest judgment. And verse 3 says, neither shalt thou countenance a poor man in his cause. So in verse 2, we're being told that we should never sway our belief from our beliefs or be pressured to go someone else's ideas. We should be true to God and true to ourselves if we truly follow God and look to live in His Word. I want to look at that verse 3, but before I do, I want to jump back just a few verses over into chapter 22. And if you look at chapter 22, verse 25 through 27, it says, "If thou lend money to any of my people that is poor by thee, thou shalt not to him be a usurer, neither shalt thou lay upon him usury. If thou at all take thy neighbor's raiment to pledge, thou shalt deliver it unto him by the sun goeth down. For that is his covering only, it is his raiment for his skin, wherein shall he sleep? And it shall come to pass, when he crieth unto me, that I will hear, for I am gracious." The Bible tells us that we should take care of people that are not as maybe fortunate as we are. In the first verse it says, lend money to the poor if they are worse off than you are. So it tells us that we should take care of those that are less fortunate than us. We should help them out. So I go back to verse 3 in chapter 23, because it was seems like it's saying something different. It says, "Neither shalt thou countenance a poor man in his cause." The word countenance used in this verse is a verb. And so I looked it up, and the definition of countenance being used as a verb is to accept, support, or approve of. So if we change the wording a little bit, verse 3 says, "Neither shalt thou accept, support, or approve of a poor man in his cause." So in today's world, there are a lot of people that take advantage. They take advantage of things. There are people probably that haven't worked in years because they're able to take advantage of. We have a president, we have a government that has been pressured into, for some reason, continuing to just give handouts left and right. And so this verse is talking about not accepting a poor man who uses his situation to his advantage for greed, maybe dishonesty or theft, anything like that. What we see in today's society, not just unemployment, government checks, disability, probably the most misused handout, if you will. There are people that need that money. There are people that absolutely are not able to work, and I understand that. But there are people that have learned to bend the rules a little bit. I talk about in my Sunday school class all the time, and Brian and Amanda and I were talking, and I think Amanda had heard of them. But I watched a documentary one time, and it was called "The Wild and Wonderful Whites of West Virginia." I don't know if you've ever seen it or ever heard of them. Amanda had actually heard of them because the father of this family was actually a famous buck dancer, and one of the sons, Jesco White, is still well known. They've made movies about him and all kinds of things. But I watched this documentary, and the father was a coal miner. And coal miners back in those days, they weren't paid in money. They were paid in store script, and all you could do was spend that at the store. So the coal mine kind of owned you because they were only paying you with script that you could use in their store. So, it was almost like you were working for them for free. And so this man was obviously very smart because he figured out how to get disability checks from the government. So not only did he get them for himself, in the documentary there's now 4 generations of this family. None of them work, and every one of them get a crazy check, if you will. They are alcoholics, they're drug addicts, all of them. And this is generations of one family that have never worked because they take advantage of these types of programs. So in verse 3, that's what the Bible's talking about. Don't let a man take advantage of his situation to do something that's dishonest. The Bible tells us that misery and sin love company. If you'll turn to Proverbs chapter 4, the verses are 14 and 16. So in chapter 4, verse 14 through 16, it says, "Enter not into the path of wicked, and And go not into the way of evil men. Avoid it. Pass not by it. Turn from it and pass away. For they sleep not except they have done mischief, and their sleep is taken away unless they cause some to fall. There are people that are so miserable and all they want to do is just pass their misery on to others and just bring them down. So the Bible tells us we should walk away from it. Don't associate with people like that. And you may or may not know anybody like that. I've met people like that. I'm sure there are people in this community that are like that. They're so miserable in their lives, and all they want to do is bring somebody else down with them. They don't want to have to live in that misery by themselves. They want to share it. And the Bible says, be aware of it and avoid it at all costs. Do not have anything to associate with it. The Bible also tells us that peer pressure often can lead to bad decision making. So if you look in Matthew chapter 14 and verse 9. Verse 9 says, And the king was sorry. Nevertheless, for the oath's sake, and them which sat with him at meat, he commanded it to be given her. So everybody knows the story of Herod and Herodias. Herod had taken his brother's wife, his brother Philip's wife, Herodias, and John the Baptist told him that it was sin. Told him it was wrong. Was really on him hard about it. And so Herod had him in prison. And the Bible tells us that Herod would have liked to have put him to death. But he was afraid because of the multitude of people that talked about, that thought John the Baptist was a prophet. So here's peer pressure of these people that think, John the Baptist is. I mean, we knew he was a great man. He was preaching about Jesus Christ. And so he didn't want to put him to death because of the multitude of people. So he has a birthday party, and Herodias' daughter comes in and dances, I guess. Apparently it was some kind of crazy, awesome dance, because he makes an oath to her. He was so pleased with this dance that he made an oath to her in front of all these people at his birthday party that she could have anything she wants. Whatever she wanted, she would have. Well, her mother, they've kind of worked out a deal. She wanted John the Baptist's head on a platter. So verse 9 says, And the king was sorry. He was sorry because he was going to have to do something that he didn't want to do. He did, but he didn't. The pressure he felt to keep John the Baptist alive was there, but yet he had made this oath, and he had made it in front of all these people at this party. Verse 9 says, And the king was sorry, nevertheless for the oath's sake. So he made a promise, and he felt that he couldn't get out of it. He had to keep his promise. And for them that sat with him at meat, so it wasn't only that he had promised this to his wife's daughter, but he had made this promise in front of all these people, and he didn't want to be the one to kind of back off of what he had promised. He felt the pressure of having to own up to what he had said. And so he did it. He had John the Baptist's head cut off and brought it to her on a platter. Things, bad decisions. We see bad decisions made every day. Young people that make bad decisions, pressured by friends to do drugs or to drink and drive or to do all kinds of things. And I mean, in high school, my senior year, I think there was one summer, a stretch of 5 or 6 weeks in a row that somebody in our class got killed in a car wreck. It was every weekend someone got killed in a car wreck. And it was drinking and driving. It was bad decisions. I grew up in a small town in Smithville, and there wasn't a lot to do. And there was a lot of pressure when you got out to, have a beer with friends or go do whatever. And unfortunately, sometimes there is consequences to those bad decisions. The It says, and they were instant with loud voices requiring that he might be crucified, him being Jesus. And the voices of them and the chief priests prevailed, and Pilate gave sentence that it should be as they required. We all know the sentence, or we all know the story of Jesus being brought before Pilate. Pilate found no fault in him whatsoever. Sent him away a couple times, trying to get out of it. But they kept coming back, and they kept pressuring him, people screaming, and big crowds just pressuring him to do this. And finally he breaks, he gives in. He gave in to peer pressure, and he made a bad mistake, and it was a tragic end. Jesus was crucified. We see these kinds of things happen every day. Again, we were just talking about the consequences of some of the bad decisions we make, and they can become tragic. Young people lose their lives. And even stupid stuff. Do you remember the news stories about the woman that was dating the younger kid or whatever and kind of seduced him through peer pressure and had him kill her husband? There's been several stories like that. We just have to be careful and never, ever put ourselves in those positions and be aware of it. Finally, the Bible tells us, though, that we should be firm and stand true to God and never, ever compromise. We should always refuse to compromise. 2 Corinthians, this is the last verse. 2 Corinthians 6:8. 2 Corinthians 6:8 says, by honor and dishonor, by evil report and good report, as deceivers and yet true. We should stand strong for God, whether people honor us or despise us, whether they criticize us or commend us, and whether they accuse us but lying when we're actually telling the truth. We're always going to be picked upon, but we should stand strong in God's will and God's direction that he gives us, and never allow us ourselves to be put in positions to make these bad decisions that would lead to tragic consequences, all these different things that we've talked about. We look at our country and we see the peer pressure that's going on in our country, and I'll give you just a few instances where the peer pressure that we see seems to be directed at us and against God's people. Abortion. Who would have ever thought that would... Ronnie and I had this conversation 100 times. Who would have ever thought in the South that these things would be made legal? Well, guess what? They weren't made legal. Our wonderful Supreme Court decided that they were going to force that on us. But the same thing with same-sex marriage. And this is what Ronnie and I discussed. I said in the South it'll never pass. And the people voted against it. And yet the Supreme Court, I guess, decided that they are smarter than the voting public. There are things that are happening. Peer pressure is leading to these. The women's rights groups. If you look at them in numbers versus the people that don't agree with them, the same thing with the same-sex marriage. Their numbers are small. What have we discussed? 2% of the population is homosexual, and yet you would think they rule the roost, buddy, because when they open their mouth, it's like everybody bows down. And if you open your mouth against them, it's no longer freedom of speech. You're a hater. You're a bigot. You're an oppressor. It's not a good place right now, and we're fighting these things every day. We see it in the church, and we've talked about it in our Sunday school class. Churches now accept homosexuals, not only as members in their church, they're allowed to hold offices in their church, and in some churches they even allow them to be the preacher. They lead the church. It's strange times, and we need to make sure that we are following what God tells us to do. I was talking again in our Sunday school class on Sunday. Kelly Garrison gave me a book for Christmas. It's called Imagine Heaven. And I enjoy books like this. It warms me up. And you can think it's weird, and I don't know if you believe in it or not, but it's a book about near-death experiences and people that say that they've actually traveled out of their body and experienced heaven in some cases and come back, and they talk about it. And the same things, the similarities behind the whole thing. But in the foreword, if you will, the little piece that they write in the beginning of the book, it was written by a pastor, and actually he was in a horrific car crash, I think in Louisiana. He had been to a meeting, a gathering of preachers, and on his way back he was hit by a semi head on, and he wrote a book. The name of the book is 90 Minutes in Heaven, and I actually have that book as well. And so I was reading his foreword, and he mentioned, people talk about heaven like it's Opryland or Disney World. I mean, it's just a place. It's a wonderful place, but they don't really know. And you read these books, and they talk about things you can't even imagine. They can't even explain it because it's so wonderful and it's so beautiful. And a lot of the one thing that most everybody kept talking about with this light, and you hear this about light, traveling to the light. Well, they talked about being enveloped in this light, and it was nothing but warmth and love, and they don't want to come back. And I don't know why God allows them to come back, but maybe it is to tell their story. I don't know. But anyway, in the foreword, he just mentions that heaven is a real place, and he mentions that it's a prepared place for a prepared people. And we were talking about it Sunday, and that one really stuck with me. A prepared place for a prepared people. There are a lot of things that we have to live with today that are distractions to us, that are taking us away and taking us our vision off of where it needs to be. And if our vision isn't where it needs to be, then we may not be prepared for the place that God's prepared for us. And we need to keep that in mind. We need to always look where we need to be looking and stay focused and tunnel vision, if you will, on where we need to be focused. Last thing, I was driving home and I was listening to, there's this Christian group they're contemporary Christian group that I like to listen to. I was listening to their song. I was listening to some music on the way home from Atlanta today. There was a song that came on, and the chorus said, in this wasteland that I live in, there's a crack in the door filled with light. And it's all I need to get by. There's a wasteland, the wasteland that I live in, there is a crack in the door filled with light, and it's all I need to shine. We should, in this world that we live in, this wasteland, this craziness that's all the time going, keep our eyes on that light, and we'll get where we want to be. We'll get to that place that God has prepared for us. And that's really all I have. I appreciate it. I thank you so much for